I wasn't looking for Freemasonry when I started this investigation. I was researching something far more mundane: the architectural standardization of civic buildings across the 19th century. I had been spending long evenings cross-referencing municipal records from Philadelphia, Edinburgh, and Calcutta, trying to understand why so many public buildings constructed between 1780 and 1880 shared identical structural proportions despite being separated by thousands of miles and belonging to entirely different cultural traditions. That was the original question, a quiet academic question, the kind that lives inside spreadsheets and library archives and never bothers anyone. Then I found floor plans. Not just any floor plans, a collection of Masonic lodge diagrams spanning 4 continents, drawn between 1740 and 1890, and archived in a private collection that was briefly digitized by a European university before the access was quietly restricted. I almost didn't look twice. Lodges, I assumed, would follow the well-documented traditions of speculative masonry, symbolic geometry, yes, but explicable geometry. The kind of symbolism that scholars have cataloged and debated openly for centuries. But there was something else embedded in these diagrams, something that didn't belong to any recognized Masonic tradition I had ever encountered, symbols that predated the founding of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, proportional systems that matched nothing in Western esoteric history, and a recurring motif, a specific interlocking pattern of arcs and perpendicular lines that I had seen before. Not in a Masonic text, not in a European archive. I had seen it on a map of Tartaria. That was the moment the official explanations began to collapse. Let me tell you what the floor plans actually showed, because the details matter here. The collection I examined contained 47 lodge diagrams from lodges operating between 1742 and 1883. The institutions represented included lodges from Charleston, South Carolina, Edinburgh, Scotland, Montevideo, Uruguay, Bombay, India, and Melbourne, Australia. These were not fringe lodges. Several of them were provincial grand lodges, the highest level of recognized Masonic administration within their respective territories. The standard Masonic lodge floor plan is well understood. The rectangular chamber oriented on an east-west axis, the mosaic pavement of black and white tiles, the twin pillars representing Jachin and Boaz from the Temple of Solomon, the position of the master's chair in the east. All of this is documented, discussed, and publicly available. There is nothing hidden about the basic geometry of a Masonic lodge. Scholars have analyzed it. Critics have dissected it. The institution itself has published guides explaining the symbolism in straightforward terms. What is not documented, what I could find no reference to in any official Masonic publication, any academic study of lodge architecture, or any esoteric history spanning the last 3 centuries, is a secondary geometric layer embedded beneath the primary floor plan in 23 of those 47 diagrams. I want to be precise about what I mean. When you overlay the floor plans at a consistent scale, and I use a scaling ratio derived from the documented standard lodge dimensions published by the United Grand Lodge of England, a second geometric structure emerges. It is not metaphorical. It is not symbolic interpretation. It is a literal geometric shape that exists only when the diagrams are superimposed. An interlocking series of arcs, each with a radius of exactly 1/7 the total length of the lodge chamber, arranged around a central perpendicular axis in a pattern that produces, unmistakably, a specific symbol. That symbol does not appear in the Hermetic tradition. It does not appear in Rosicrucian iconography. It does not appear in the Kabbalah. It does not appear in any of the recognized source traditions that scholars have connected to speculative masonry's symbolic vocabulary. It appears with extraordinary precision in cartouches decorating maps of Greater Tartaria printed between 1680 and 1750, maps housed in collections of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the Royal Geographical Society in London, and the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. I examined photographic reproductions of those cartouches alongside the overlay I had constructed. The grain of the archival photographs was coarse, as you expect from documents of that age. But the symbol was unmistakable. The proportions matched, not approximately, not suggestively. The arcs aligned to within a margin of measurement error smaller than the width of the original cartographer's pen stroke. I showed the overlay to 2 people with backgrounds in architectural history. Neither recognized the secondary geometric layer as belonging to any tradition they had studied. One of them said quietly that it reminded her of something she had seen in Central Asian decorative stonework, though she could not place a specific source. The other said nothing at all. The official explanation for decorative variation in Masonic floor plans is that individual lodges exercise latitude in their architectural interpretations, that local craftsmen introduced regional stylistic elements, that the geometry was never meant to be perfectly standardized. This explanation is reasonable, even convincing, if you look at one lodge at a time. It collapses completely when you look at 23 lodges across 5 continents in 5 different centuries, all producing the same secondary pattern when overlaid at the same scale. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern does not stay confined to floor plans. That would be easier to explain away. What struck me, as I expanded my investigation beyond the architectural diagrams and into the physical fabric of surviving lodge buildings, was how consistently the same proportional system appeared in the built structures themselves, not hidden in overlays, but present in the actual stone and timber rooms that still exist and can still be visited. In St. Petersburg, the Lodge Hall constructed on Nevsky Prospect in 1771, a building that later passed through several institutional identities and survives today under a different administrative function, has a ceiling height to floor area ratio of 1 to 7.3. In Buenos Aires, the lodge constructed in the Montserrat neighborhood in 1843 shares that ratio almost exactly, 1 to 7.2, within the tolerances of 19th century construction. In Delhi, a Masonic hall built by British administrators in 1856 presents the same proportion, 1 to 7.3. In Cape Town, 1834, the ratio appears again. In Quebec City, 1791, it appears once more. 7 is not an unusual number in symbolic architecture. Sacred geometry across many traditions privileges certain ratios: the golden ratio, the ratios of the Pythagorean tradition, the proportions attributed to the Temple of Solomon. A skeptic would say that any sufficiently large sample of architectural data will produce coincidental numerical convergences. That is a reasonable objection, and I have sat with it seriously. But the objection loses force when you examine what the 1 to 7.3 ratio actually implies structurally. It is not an aesthetically pleasing proportion. It does not produce the visual harmony of the golden ratio. It does not align with any proportion documented in Western classical architecture. Not Vitruvius, not Palladio, not Wren. An architect designing for beauty or for symbolic resonance within the known Western tradition would not arrive at this ratio. You would have to be working from a different set of instructions entirely. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across cities that had no documented architectural communication with one another, in lodges governed by different grand lodges operating under different administrative traditions, built by craftsmen who spoke different languages, in climates that imposed entirely different structural constraints. St. Petersburg's winters would demand different wall thicknesses than Cape Town's temperate climate. Buenos Aires' humidity would impose different timber considerations than Delhi's dry heat. And yet the interior proportion persists, unchanged across all of them. Who were they built for? The name Tartaria appears on European maps from the late 16th century onward, growing in specificity and detail through the 17th and into the 18th century. This is not a marginal curiosity. This is documented cartographic history available for examination in the archives of every major European library, on maps produced by Blau, by Mercator's successors, by Coronelli, by Delisle, on maps produced for kings and empires and trading companies. The territory labeled Tartaria or Grand Tartary stretches across an enormous expanse of the Eurasian landmass. At its greatest depicted extent, it encompasses what we now call Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, and significant portions of what is today northern China. Not a legend, not a myth, a named, delineated, cartographically recognized territory, depicted with the same matter-of-fact precision that European cartographers apply to France or the Ottoman Empire. And then, in a historical process that no conventional history has ever satisfactorily explained, it disappears. Not conquered in a single identifiable war, not renamed through a documented political transition, not gradually absorbed through a process that left archival traces. The territory simply ceases to appear on maps, progressively, between approximately 1750 and 1820. The name fades from official documents. The administrative references vanish. The trade records that once mentioned Tartarian merchants become sparse, then absent. By the mid-19th century, the enormous territory that had appeared on European maps for 200 years is simply not there, replaced by the expanding administrative designations of the Russian Empire on one side and the Qing dynasty on the other, with no explanatory record of what the transition involved or what happened to people and institutions that had constituted Tartaria's documented presence. Now, consider the timeline of Masonic expansion. The Grand Lodge of England is formally constituted in 1717. Within 50 years, lodges have been established across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa, an expansion that proceeded with remarkable speed and organizational coherence for an era of slow communication. And the lodges being built during that precise window, 1740 to 1820, are the ones that carry the secondary geometric layer, the 1 to 7.3 proportion, the symbol that appears in Tartarian cartouches. The connection between Masonic architectural tradition and the disappearing territory on European maps becomes impossible to ignore. I do not rely solely on geometric analysis and cartographic evidence. There is a paper record, partial and fragmented, but real, and what that record shows is almost more disturbing than its absence would be. The Illustrated London News, 1847, carried a brief notice regarding the discovery, during renovation of a lodge hall in Bristol, of a stone tablet bearing inscriptions that the article described as resembling no known Eastern or Western script, though possessing the formal regularity of a deliberately constructed written language. The article is 3 paragraphs long. It was never followed up. I found no subsequent coverage in any London publication of the period. The Edinburgh Philosophical Journal, 1831, published a short correspondence from a reader who had recently returned from travels through what he described as the former Tartarian territories, the region then being absorbed into Russian administrative control. He described encountering building ruins bearing decorative stonework that reminded him, he wrote, of the ornamental work I have observed in several of our older lodge halls in Scotland, though I confess I cannot account for the correspondence. The correspondence was not published in the following issue. The reader's name does not appear again in the journal's records. The New York Herald, 1871, reported on an auction at which a collection of surveying and philosophical instruments of uncertain Eastern provenance was sold. The catalog description noted that several instruments bore markings consistent with the symbolism employed in fraternal societies of the speculative tradition. The instruments were purchased by a private collector whose identity the article does not record. No subsequent reference to those instruments appears in any auction record I have been able to locate. The Chicago Tribune, 1893, in coverage of the World's Columbian Exposition, published a sidebar noting that several architectural details of the White City's principal buildings have been drawn from a pre-existing proportional system of considerable antiquity, the origins of which remain a matter of scholarly debate among the architects involved. None of the architects quoted in the main article were willing to elaborate on that point when directly questioned. The Calcutta Review, 1907, published an academic article examining Masonic lodge construction in British India and noting the consistent interior proportions of lodges built across dramatically different regional contexts. The author proposed that this consistency suggests the influence of an architectural canon, not yet fully documented by Western scholarship. The article received one published response, a brief dismissal from a fellow academic who described the proportional convergence as coincidental and unworthy of further inquiry. The original author published nothing further on the subject. After approximately 1920, the references stop, not gradually. Abruptly, the photographs stop, the reports stop, the maps change. The Smithsonian Institution's catalog of non-Western architectural instruments, compiled in the 1920s, contains a section on instruments of uncertain Central Asian provenance that was apparently included in early draft versions of the catalog, but is absent from the published edition. I know about the draft because a single Xerox page from it, apparently photocopied from an archival copy held somewhere outside the Smithsonian's publicly accessible collections, circulates among researchers in this area. The page describes instruments with markings that match the symbol I identified in the Masonic floor plan overlay. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if Freemasonry, as it emerged and formalized in the early 18th century, was not constructing a new symbolic tradition, but preserving an old one? What if the operative Masons, the actual builders, the craftsmen who constructed the cathedrals and civic buildings and palaces of medieval and early modern Europe, carried with them, through their guild traditions, a set of architectural and symbolic practices that originated not in the Holy Land, not in Egypt, not in the classical Mediterranean world that Masonic mythology references, but in the vast and now erased civilization that Europeans called Tartaria? This would explain the geometric embedding. If the symbolic system was being preserved rather than invented, its practitioners would embed it in ways that were invisible to the uninitiated, present in the buildings of those with eyes to see it, absent from any document that might draw unwanted scrutiny. The overlay method I described is precisely the kind of encoding a preservationist tradition would use, not hidden in a vault, hidden in plain sight, in the proportions of rooms that thousands of people have walked through without seeing the second layer of meaning. This would explain the geographical consistency. The same symbol, the same ratio on 5 continents, across a century of construction. Not because lodge architects in Charleston were communicating with lodge architects in Bombay, but because both were working from the same inherited canon, a canon that predated the Grand Lodge, predated speculative Masonry as we know it, predated perhaps the oldest documents that Masonic tradition points to as its foundation. And this would explain why Tartaria and Freemasonry disappear from the documentary record in precisely the same historical window. If the territory whose symbolic tradition Masonry was preserving was being erased, its maps overwritten, its administrative presence absorbed, its people dispersed or assimilated, then those who had been preserving its traditions within the lodge system would have had powerful reasons to deepen the concealment, to move the symbols further underground, to remove the paper trail. Why would those doing the erasing care about symbols in lodge floors? Because symbols are memory, and whoever controlled what could be remembered controlled what could be reclaimed. They don't debate this. That is the first thing you notice when you try to bring any of this into academic discourse. A serious challenge, something with documented evidence, specific measurements, reproducible observations, would invite serious engagement. It would generate papers, counter-analyses, methodological critiques. That is how genuine scholarly controversy works. You can watch it happen in real time in any number of historical debates. This generates none of that. It generates silence. It's not active suppression. It's passive erasure. The difference is important, and it is more effective than suppression would be. Active suppression creates martyrs, creates records of suppression itself, generates a kind of friction that draws attention. Passive erasure simply does not respond. The question is not answered. The evidence is not engaged with. The researcher is not attacked. They are simply not cited, not invited, not published, not included in the conversation that determines what becomes established knowledge and what remains marginal. I have attempted to raise the question of the floor plan overlay with 3 separate academics whose published work touches on Masonic architectural history. 2 did not respond to my communications at all. One responded briefly to say that he was not aware of the collection I had referenced and that he would not be able to comment on evidence he had not personally examined. That is a reasonable position stated in reasonable terms. But it is also a position that neatly prevents any engagement from ever occurring, because the collection is not easily accessible, and the barrier to accessing it is not insurmountable, but is sufficiently inconvenient that most people will not attempt it. The pattern repeats across disciplines. Architectural historians defer to Masonic scholars. Masonic scholars defer to institutional historians. Institutional historians defer to the archival record. And the archival record, where it touches on the most sensitive of these questions, has gaps that are themselves undocumented. Absences that do not appear as absences in any catalog because of records that would indicate what was removed were themselves removed. In Central Asian archaeology, the same silence operates. Excavations in the former Tartarian territories have produced decorative stonework that regional archaeologists have published in specialist journals, work that is competent, careful, and almost entirely uncited outside its immediate field. The broader historical community is simply not engaging with what is being found in those excavations, not arguing against it, not incorporating it, ignoring it with a thoroughness that only institutional habit can sustain across generations of scholars. This is how a civilization gets erased twice, once in the maps and once in the disciplines that might have noticed the maps were wrong. Beyond the floor plans and the built proportions, there's a third category of evidence that I want to address, because it is the most physically immediate and the hardest to explain away through interpretive flexibility. The instruments. Masonic ritual involves a set of working tools, the square, the level, the plumb, the compass, that are deployed symbolically during lodge ceremonies. These are well documented. Their symbolic meanings are publicly explained. Their physical forms are standardized and uncontroversial. But an auction record from the 19th century, estate sales, lodge dissolutions, collections dispersed after the deaths of prominent Masons, there are occasional references to instruments that do not fit the standard toolkit. These references are brief and usually dismissive. An 1864 Sotheby's catalog entry describes a brass instrument of unknown ceremonial function, bearing engraved decorations in a non-Western style, provenance unstated. The instrument's dimensions are listed: 34 centimeters in length, with a central pivot point located at 14.2 centimeters from one end, a ratio, again, of approximately 1 to 2.4, which is not a standard proportion in any Western measuring tradition, but which appears repeatedly in Central Asian metalwork of the 17th and 18th centuries. An 1891 estate sale catalog from Edinburgh lists various fraternal implements, including several pieces of uncertain origin, possibly Eastern. No further description. No subsequent record of where those pieces went. In a Vienna museum collection, I will not name the specific institution, because the piece is not publicly displayed and the museum has not formally acknowledged its presence in their holdings, though I have seen a photograph taken by a researcher who was permitted access to the storage facility. There is a brass instrument approximately 40 centimeters long, engraved with symbol that is unmistakably the same interlocking arc pattern I identified in the floor plan overlay. The museum's internal label, visible in the photograph, describes it as Masonic implement, origin unknown, possibly Central Asian, 18th century, possibly Central Asian, 18th century. At the moment when Tartaria was disappearing from the maps and Masonic lodges were proliferating across the world, carrying in their floors and walls and instruments a geometric signature that points, consistently and precisely, toward the same vanished source. And suddenly the instrument isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. I began this investigation asking why civic buildings across the 19th century shared identical proportions. That question has not been answered. It has been deepened, because the civic buildings that share those proportions are not random. They cluster consistently around cities with active Masonic presences. They were frequently built by architects who were lodge members, and they carry in their interior ratios the same signature I found in the lodge floor plans, faint but present, the way a watermark is present in paper, invisible in direct light, legible when held up to the right angle of illumination. Why would an organization dedicated, by its own account, to moral philosophy and fraternal fellowship embed a pre-existing geometric canon in its buildings across 5 continents? Why would that canon match the decorative tradition of a civilization that was being systematically removed from the historical record at precisely the same moment? Why would the paper trail documenting these connections become sparse after 1850 and effectively vanish after 1920? Why would the academic disciplines best positioned to notice these patterns be the ones least likely to engage with them? Why do the instruments persist in museum storage, unlabeled or mislabeled, while the questions they would answer remain unasked? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies pattern, a pattern that connects a floor plan in Charleston to a cartouche on a French map, to a brass instrument in a Viennese storage room, to a ceiling height in Buenos Aires, to a decorative stone tablet found during a Bristol renovation and never mentioned again. A pattern that points, always, toward the same absence, the same enormous, deliberate, astonishingly successful erasure of a civilization that was large enough to appear on European maps for 200 years and thorough enough to disappear without leaving conventional historical account of how or why. I don't have definitive answers, only questions. And I think the questions matter, because what is at stake here is not merely an academic puzzle about architectural history. What is at stake is the possibility that we have inherited a version of the past that was constructed for us, edited, simplified, and in certain crucial places simply emptied out, and that the evidence of what was removed is still present, still legible, still waiting in the proportions of rooms we walk through without seeing, and instruments cataloged as origin unknown, in storage rooms we are not invited to enter. The buildings still stand. The ratios are still there, measurable, reproducible, available to anyone with a tape measure and the willingness to look. The symbol is still in the floor plans, waiting in the overlay, patient in a way that only stone and mathematics can be patient, outlasting the people who embedded it, outlasting perhaps the memory of why it was embedded, but not outlasting the questions it raises for anyone who finally takes the time to look. Whatever was preserved in those lodges, whatever tradition was carried forward in the geometry of rooms built from St. Petersburg to Buenos Aires to Bombay, it has not entirely disappeared. The erasure was not complete. It never is. That may be the most important thing I found.